Why does Cuba matter so much? It is a small island, home to barely 11 million people, with no oil, no nuclear arsenal, and no great military power. And yet, Spain bled for it for nearly 400 years. The United States invaded it twice, blockaded it, funded an army to retake it, and plotted to assassinate its leader more than 600 times. The Soviet Union nearly started a nuclear war over it. Why? What is it about Cuba that has made every great power in the modern world willing to risk everything to control it or destroy it? The answer stretches back 5 centuries, to the moment this island was baptized in conquest and slavery, and it runs straight through sugar, revolution, Cold War brinkmanship, and 60 years of defiance. This documentary tells the complete story of Cuba, and by the end, you will understand exactly why this small island changed the world. Long before any European ship crested the horizon, long before the crack of cannon fire or the rustle of unfamiliar sails, the island we now call Cuba was already alive with human history. Stretching nearly 800 miles from end to end, this great arc of land sits at the northwestern edge of the Caribbean, commanding the passages between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Its position was, and remains, one of the most strategically significant in the entire Western Hemisphere. But for thousands of years, only its own people knew this. The first inhabitants arrived not by conquest, but by slow, patient migration. The Guanahatabi people, among the earliest to settle the island, are believed to have crossed into Cuba from Central America and the Florida Peninsula perhaps as far back as 10,000 years ago. They were nomadic, living close to the shore, sustained by fishing and foraging. They left behind little in the way of permanent structures, but their shell middens and stone tools scattered across the western tip of the island tell a quiet, enduring story of survival. Following them came the Siboney, migrating northward from South America across the island chains of the Caribbean. The Siboney settled more broadly across Cuban territory, developing modest but stable communities. They too were fishers and gatherers, skilled at reading the rhythms of the sea and the land. Yet they would eventually find themselves pushed to the margins by a far more dynamic and organized people arriving from the south. The Taíno transformed Cuba. Originating from the Arawakan peoples of the Orinoco Basin in present-day Venezuela, the Taíno expanded across the Caribbean over many centuries, reaching Cuba perhaps around 1,500 years ago. By the time Columbus arrived, they were the dominant culture on the island, numbering perhaps in the hundreds of thousands. What distinguished the Taíno was the sophistication of their society. They cultivated cassava, sweet potatoes, maize, and tobacco with systematic agricultural skill, clearing fields called conucos that sustained large, organized villages. Their social structure was clearly defined, with a hereditary nobility sitting above commoners, and at the apex of each community sat the cacique, a chief whose authority shaped everything from trade to ceremony. Women could hold this title too, a detail that often surprises those who imagine pre-Columbian societies as uniformly patriarchal. The Taíno were artists, traders, and navigators. Their canoes crossed open water to neighboring islands, maintaining networks of exchange across the Caribbean world. They played a ritual ball game. They carved intricate figures from wood and stone. They had names for storms, for stars, for the spirits they believed inhabited the world around them. This was the Cuba that waited on the far side of 1492. A living world, fully formed, standing on the edge of a collision it could not have imagined. On the morning of October 28, 1492, Christopher Columbus guided his small fleet toward a coastline unlike anything his crew had encountered since leaving Spain. The land rose green and lush from the water, threaded with rivers, draped in forests so dense and so vibrant that Columbus reached for the grandest language he knew. He wrote in his journal that it was the most beautiful land that human eyes had ever seen. He had no idea where he was. Columbus was searching for Asia. He was hunting for the outer islands of Japan, or perhaps the mainland coast of China, the legendary lands of spices and silk described by Marco Polo 2 centuries earlier. When Cuba appeared before him, stretching further east and west than any island he had yet encountered, he became convinced he had found it. This, he reasoned, must be the Asian continent itself. No mere island could be so vast. The Taíno who greeted the Spanish along Cuba's northeastern shore were curious and, at first, welcoming. They offered food, water, and hospitality. Columbus observed them with the calculating eye of a man who saw not neighbors but subjects, not a civilization but a resource. He noted their gentleness, their generosity, and their apparent lack of metal weapons. In the same breath, he noted that they would make fine servants. Columbus did not linger. His obsession with reaching the courts of Asian emperors drove him onward, and Cuba became a stop, a waypoint, a curiosity rather than a destination. He coasted along its northeastern shore, sent men inland to search for signs of cities and palaces, and found only the ordered villages of the Taíno and the deep, improbable beauty of the interior. When his scouts returned reporting no gold-roofed kingdoms, only the quiet authority of local caciques, Columbus moved on. But the claim had been made. Spain's flag, however briefly planted, had asserted dominion over an island the Taíno had no reason to believe was anyone's to claim. Columbus returned to Cuba on his second voyage in 1494, still searching, still insisting. He demanded that his crew sign a document affirming that Cuba was not an island but a continent, threatening punishment to anyone who said otherwise. It was an act of extraordinary self-deception, the behavior of a man bending reality to fit a dream that was already unraveling. The Spanish crown, meanwhile, was assembling the machinery of empire. The Caribbean islands were being mapped, cataloged, and divided. Hispaniola was already suffering under early colonial rule. Cuba's turn was coming. What began with wonder, with a navigator's breathless declaration of paradise found, would soon become something far darker. The island that Columbus called the most beautiful in the world was about to meet the men who would reshape it entirely. Those men were already sailing west. Diego Velázquez de Cuellar was not a man who trafficked in sentiment. A veteran of the brutal conquest of Hispaniola, he arrived on Cuba's eastern shore in 1511 with roughly 300 soldiers, a mandate from the Spanish governor, and a very clear understanding of what conquest actually meant. It meant fire. It meant submission. It meant the transformation of a living civilization into a labor supply. He began at the eastern end of the island, establishing the settlement of Baracoa, Spain's first permanent foothold on Cuban soil. It was a modest beginning for what would become one of the most consequential colonial possessions in history. From Baracoa, Velázquez pushed inland and westward, founding settlement after settlement, stitching a Spanish geography across a landscape that had its own names, its own order, its own memory. The Taíno were not entirely without resistance. A chief named Hatui had actually arrived in Cuba before the Spanish did. Fleeing the devastation of Hispaniola, he had crossed the waters to warn Cuba's indigenous people about what was coming. He knew, firsthand, what the Europeans wanted. According to accounts recorded by the Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas, Hatui gathered his people and held before them a basket of gold. This, he told them, was the God the Spanish worshipped. This was what they killed for. Hatui organized armed resistance in the forests of eastern Cuba, using knowledge of the terrain to frustrate the Spanish advance for months. But guerrilla resistance could only hold so long against armored soldiers, war dogs, and steel. By 1512, Hatui had been captured. His execution became one of the most haunting scenes in the entire history of the Spanish conquest. Bound to a stake, facing death by fire, he was approached by a Franciscan friar who offered him the chance to accept Christianity and thereby enter heaven. Hatui asked whether Spanish people would also be in heaven. When the friar said yes, Hatui said he would prefer not to go. He burned. His defiance would echo across centuries. Today, his face appears on Cuba's most popular beer, a strange immortality for a man who died resisting everything the island would become. With resistance broken, Velázquez installed the encomienda system across Cuba. Under this arrangement, Spanish settlers were granted not just land but the labor of the Taíno people living on it. Indigenous men and women were assigned to colonists and put to work, mining for gold in rivers, clearing forest, constructing buildings, and producing food for a settler population that consumed without producing. The work was punishing. The conditions were lethal. People who had never labored in mines before were driven into rivers and streams to sift sediment from dawn to dusk. And then the diseases arrived in earnest. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The Taíno had no immunity to any of them. What violence and overwork began, epidemic sickness accelerated beyond anything the Spanish themselves anticipated. Whole villages vanished. Communities that had sustained themselves for centuries simply ceased to exist within years. The population collapsed so rapidly that even those Spanish settlers who depended on Taíno labor found themselves without a workforce. By 1540, the island's indigenous population had been reduced from an estimated 100,000 people, some historians say far more, to a few thousand. Within another decade, they were for all practical purposes gone. A people who had inhabited Cuba for more than 1,000 years had been erased within a single generation. The gold the Spanish found in Cuba's rivers was also disappointingly scarce. By the 1520s, colonists were already abandoning the island for more promising conquests on the American mainland. Cuba risked becoming a ghost colony, populated only by the echoes of catastrophe. What saved it economically, and what would define its character for the next 3 centuries, was a decision the Spanish made in response to the Taínos' extinction. If indigenous labor was gone, they would import labor from elsewhere. The ships that had carried soldiers west would soon carry a very different kind of passenger east. San Cristobal de la Habana was not born in one place. It wandered. Founded first in 1519 on Cuba's southern coast, the settlement proved poorly positioned, plagued by mosquitoes, and separated from the island's best natural harbor. Within 2 years, colonists had relocated the town to the northern shore, anchoring it at last to a deep, protected bay that would, in time, become one of the most strategically important bodies of water on Earth. It was a modest beginning. A few hundred settlers, a handful of wooden structures, a church. Nobody watching the early clearing of that jungle shoreline could have imagined what would rise in its place. What transformed Havana from a struggling outpost into the nerve center of Spain's American empire was geography and the peculiar logic of wind and current. Spanish ships sailing home from the Americas needed to catch the Gulf Stream, the great oceanic conveyor belt that swept vessels northeast toward Europe. To catch it, they had to pass through the Florida Straits, the narrow channel between Cuba's northern coast and the peninsula of Florida. Havana sat at the western entrance to that channel like a cork in a bottle. Every ship going home passed Havana. Every ship stopping for water, provisions, repairs, and military escort passed Havana. By the 1530s, the Spanish crown had recognized the obvious. Havana became the mandatory gathering point for the flota system, the annual treasure fleet that carried silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru back to Seville. Ships would collect in the harbor, sometimes dozens at a time, their holds weighted with silver ingots, gold, pearls, and dye. Then, in convoy, they would run the gauntlet home. The wealth concentrating in that harbor made Havana irresistible to enemies. Pirates and privateers circled the Caribbean like sharks following a wounded whale. French corsairs struck first, raiding the harbor itself in 1538 and burning portions of the town to the ground. The Spanish response was stone. Over the following decades, Havana received some of the most formidable military engineering in the Americas. El Morro Castle, begun in 1589, rose on the headland guarding the harbor entrance, its thick limestone walls designed to absorb cannon fire and project Spanish power across the water. La Punta Fortress anchored the opposite side of the channel. Together, they could catch any hostile vessel in a murderous crossfire. The fortifications announced something important. This city was not merely a colonial settlement. It was a strategic asset worth defending at enormous cost. Inside the walls, Havana was growing into something genuinely cosmopolitan. Sailors, merchants, soldiers, priests, enslaved Africans, and colonial administrators crowded its streets. Taverns and warehouses multiplied along the waterfront. The smell of salt water, timber, and tobacco drifted through streets of packed earth and gradually stone. That tobacco was significant. While silver and gold commanded the imperial imagination, Cuba's first homegrown export was quietly building an economy of its own. Indigenous Cubans had cultivated the plant for centuries. Spanish settlers and, increasingly, the merchants of Havana recognized its commercial potential. By the 1600s, Cuban tobacco was prized across Europe, setting the island on an agricultural path it would follow for centuries to come. By the end of the 1600s, Havana was a city of monuments, commerce, and constant vigilance, a place where treasure and danger arrived on the same tide. The flota system that had made it powerful was also making it a target, as rival empires grew bolder, and the Caribbean's delicate Spanish order began to crack at the edges. That pressure would only intensify as a new century dawned, and new powers arrived to contest everything Spain had built. For 2 centuries, Havana's harbor had held off every attacker. French corsairs, English privateers, Dutch raiders, all had broken against those limestone walls. Then, in the summer of 1762, Britain arrived with something different. Not a raid. An army. The 7 Years' War had spread conflict across 4 continents, and Britain's strategists understood what Spain had long known. Whoever controlled Havana controlled the arteries of the American trade. In June of 1762, a fleet of over 200 British ships carrying nearly 14,000 troops appeared off the Cuban coast. The attack came not from the harbor entrance, where El Morro's cannons could shred any vessel, but from the east, overland. British soldiers scaled the heights above the fortress, dragged artillery through jungle and heat, and spent weeks in a grinding siege beneath a merciless tropical sun. Thousands died from yellow fever and dysentery before a single wall fell. El Morro held for 66 days. When British engineers detonated a mine beneath its foundations on the 30th of July, the explosion tore the fortress apart and broke the city's will. Havana surrendered in August. For the first time in its history, the jewel of Spain's American empire flew a foreign flag. The British occupation lasted only 11 months, but 11 months was enough to change everything. Spain had run Cuba as a closed system, tightly regulated, trade flowing only to and from the motherland. Britain threw that system open. Merchants from Britain and its North American colonies poured into Havana, bringing manufactured goods and hunger for profit. And to feed that hunger, they brought enslaved Africans in staggering numbers. In a single year, British traders imported approximately 10,000 enslaved people into Cuba, more than had arrived in the previous decade combined. The plantation machine was being assembled. When the Treaty of Paris ended the war in February of 1763, Spain faced an agonizing choice. Britain had also seized Florida, and it would not give up both prizes. Spain traded Florida for Havana, recovering its beloved harbor but surrendering a continental territory. Britain got a peninsula. Cuba remained Spanish. Spain's ministers were shaken. Their most valuable colonial city had fallen in a summer. The lesson was clear, and the Spanish crown drew two conclusions. First, Cuba's defenses needed to be rebuilt and strengthened beyond anything previously imagined. Second, the island's economy had to be developed deliberately so that its strategic value would be matched by genuine productive wealth. The reforms that followed reshaped Cuba fundamentally. Trade restrictions were gradually loosened. Sugar, which had grown modestly on the island for generations, now received every encouragement. Land was cleared on an enormous scale. Mills multiplied. And with the mills came an insatiable demand for labor that could only be supplied under the brutal logic of the age by the continued importation of enslaved Africans. By the 1780s, Cuba was transforming before the eyes of those who lived there. The sleepy colonial backwater was becoming something else entirely, a sugar island, raw and hungry and growing at a pace that alarmed even its beneficiaries. The older Havana of merchants and sailors and colonial administrators was not disappearing, but it was being joined by something far more intense and far more brutal. What neither Spain nor Cuba's Creole planters could fully see yet was the terrible engine they were building. The same Caribbean winds that had once carried silver fleets home to Seville were now filling the sails of slave ships, and the transformation they were carrying would prove far more consequential than any siege. A revolution brewing on a neighboring island was about to accelerate everything. In the summer of 1791, the night sky over Saint-Domingue turned orange. On the western third of the island of Hispaniola, enslaved people had risen in one of the most consequential rebellions in the history of the Americas. Plantations burned from the northern plains to the coast. The colony that had produced roughly 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe, and more than half its coffee, was being consumed by fire and war. Within a decade, Saint-Domingue would be gone, replaced by Haiti, the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The destruction of Saint-Domingue's plantation economy sent shockwaves through every sugar market in the Atlantic world. Prices spiked. European merchants scrambled. And in Cuba, the island's planter class saw something terrifying and irresistible at the same moment. An opening had appeared, vast as the sky, and they intended to fill it. What followed was a transformation of staggering speed. Cuba's sugar output, already growing, now exploded. In 1790, the island had produced roughly 14,000 tons of sugar annually. By 1850, that figure had risen to over 300,000 tons. Cuba had become, in the space of 2 generations, the single largest sugar producer on Earth. To achieve this, the island's planters needed land and labor in quantities that dwarfed anything previously imagined. The forests of western and central Cuba were cleared at a relentless pace. Rivers were redirected. The landscape itself was remade to serve the plantation. And at the center of everything stood the ingenio, the sugar mill complex, a world unto itself, brutal and efficient and insatiable. The labor powering all of it came almost entirely from Africa. Between 1790 and 1867, more than 600,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to Cuba. The trade continued even after Spain nominally banned it, driven underground by corruption and profit. Ships sailing under false flags landed human cargo on remote beaches in the dead of night. Cuban officials looked the other way or actively participated. The numbers kept rising. On the ingenias, conditions were among the harshest anywhere in the Atlantic world. The sugar harvest, called the zafra, ran for months without meaningful rest. Enslaved workers fed cane into iron rollers day and night, the machinery grinding without pause, the furnaces burning through the darkness. Overseers counted minutes. Exhaustion was not an excuse. The death rate on Cuban sugar plantations was so severe that the entire enslaved population required constant replenishment simply to hold steady. Planters calculated human lives as they calculated the price of cane. And yet the people subjected to this system refused to simply endure it in silence. Resistance took many forms. Slow work, sabotage of equipment, the preservation of African spiritual traditions that planters could not fully reach or destroy. There were outright rebellions as well, including the latter conspiracy of 1844, in which authorities, terrified by the possibility of a Haitian-style uprising, tortured and executed hundreds of free Black Cubans and enslaved people accused of plotting revolution. The brutal repression revealed something important. The planter class understood deep in its bones that the world it had built rested on a foundation that the people supporting it had every reason to tear apart. By the middle of the 19th century, Cuba's wealth was extraordinary and its contradictions were equally immense. Havana had become one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Americas, full of theaters, newspapers, and elegant architecture. The Creole elite read Enlightenment philosophy and sent their sons to universities in Europe and the United States. They spoke of progress and civilization. And in the fields beyond the city, hundreds of thousands of people lived in bondage to make that civilization possible. The tension between these two realities could not hold forever. The same winds of liberalism and nationalism that were reshaping Europe and the Americas were reaching Cuban shores. carrying questions that the planter class preferred not to answer. What did it mean to build a nation on slavery? And if that foundation cracked, what would replace it? Those questions were about to find their voices. By the 1820s, nearly every Spanish colony on the American mainland had broken free. From Mexico to Argentina, new republics were declaring themselves, drawing borders, raising flags. The age of Spanish Empire was visibly collapsing, and yet Cuba remained. The question that hung over the island, unspoken in polite society, but impossible to ignore, was a simple one. Why? The answer lived in the cane fields. Cuba's Creole elite, the island-born planters and merchants who had grown fabulously wealthy from sugar, understood something with cold clarity. Independence, in the context of an island where enslaved people outnumbered free citizens in many provinces, was not an invitation to freedom. It was a lit match held over a powder keg. The example of Haiti haunted every conversation. A revolution against Spain might become something else entirely, something none of them could control. And so, for a generation, Cuba's wealthy classes chose loyalty over liberation, earning the island its official Spanish designation as the ever-faithful Isle. Spain rewarded this faithfulness with tightening control. A series of captain generals ruled the island with near absolute authority through the 1830s and 40s, suppressing political debate, censoring the press, and crushing any hint of organized dissent. Cuba had no elected legislature, no genuine representation in Madrid, and no legal avenue for reform. The island existed to generate revenue, and Spain intended to keep it that way. But discontent found other outlets. Some Creole elites, particularly those with business ties to the United States, began looking northward. If independence was too dangerous and Spanish rule too suffocating, perhaps annexation offered a third path. A Cuba joined to the American South would preserve slavery, they reasoned, while trading Spanish despotism for the familiar machinery of plantation democracy. This annexationist dream found its most dramatic expression in Narciso López, a Venezuelan-born soldier who launched 3 filibuster expeditions from American shores in the late 1840s and early 1850s. López landed in Cuba with small armies of volunteers, raised the Cuban flag he himself had designed, and called on the island to rise. It did not. Spanish forces captured him in 1851, and López was publicly executed by garrote in Havana, becoming the first martyr of Cuban independence, however complicated his actual politics had been. While soldiers and schemers argued over Cuba's future, a poet had already begun imagining it. José María Heredia, exiled from Cuba in his 20s for conspiracy against Spanish rule, wrote verse that transformed the island's landscape into longing. His most celebrated poem gazed at Niagara Falls and ached for the palms of his homeland. It was the first sustained voice of what would become Cuban cultural nationalism, the insistence that Cuba possessed a distinct identity, a soul, that no colonial authority could fully own. By the mid-1860s, Spain offered modest reforms, then withdrew them. The patience of an entire generation was nearly exhausted. On the morning of October 10, 1868, a sugar planter in eastern Cuba made a decision that would cost him everything and change his island forever. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes walked to the quarters where his enslaved workers lived, and he freed them, every one of them. Then he invited them to join him in war. His declaration, delivered at his plantation near the town of Yara, was a single defiant cry. Cuba must be free. The moment entered history as the Grito de Yara, the cry of Yara, and within days, the island's long-suppressed fury had found its first open flame. Cespedes was no radical in the mold of a revolutionary philosopher. He was a wealthy man who had exhausted every other option. Petitions had been ignored. Reform proposals had been rejected by Madrid. The Creole elite of the eastern provinces, poorer and less invested in the plantation system than their Western counterparts, had decided that patience was simply another word for surrender. The fighters who rallied to his cause called themselves Mambises, a term the Spanish had originally used as an insult, borrowed perhaps from an African word for those who fought in the bush. The Cubans wore it as a badge of honor. These were the Mambi guerrillas, and they understood something the Spanish generals did not. A conventional war against Spain's professional army was unwinnable. A war of the forests, the mountains, the hidden valleys of Oriente Province was something else entirely. They struck fast, melted into the jungle, and struck again. The machete became their signature weapon, terrifyingly effective in close quarters and impossible to embargo. Spain could blockade a rifle. It could not blockade a cutting blade already on every plantation in Cuba. Into this struggle stepped a figure who would become perhaps the most celebrated military leader in Cuban history. Antonio Maceo was the son of a free Afro-Cuban farmer, and he rose through the rebel ranks on sheer ferocity and tactical brilliance. By his mid-20s, he was commanding major engagements. His presence embodied something the independence movement desperately needed to prove, that this was not simply a rebellion of white Creole landowners protecting their own interests. Afro-Cubans, many of them former enslaved people who had been freed specifically to join the fight, comprised a vital part of the Mambi forces. Maceo made their contribution impossible to ignore or minimize. Spain's response to the insurgency was methodical and brutal. Commanders deployed what they called reconcentración tactics, forcibly relocating rural populations to deny the guerrillas food and shelter. Villages were burned. Crops were destroyed. The Spanish military understood that the Mambises moved through the Cuban countryside like fish through water, and their answer was to drain the water. The death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers died in battle. Civilians died of disease and starvation in the crowded concentration zones. Cuba's eastern provinces were left largely devastated by the time the decade neared its close. Yet the rebellion could not win either. The wealthy Western planters never joined in significant numbers. The promised slave revolt never fully materialized. Supplies and reinforcements from abroad arrived too slowly and too rarely. Cespedes himself was killed by Spanish troops in 1874, hunted down in the mountains where his revolution had begun. By 1878, both sides were exhausted. Spanish negotiators and rebel commanders signed the Pact of Zañón in February of that year, a compromise that promised reforms, gradual emancipation, and amnesty. It promised, in other words, everything the rebels had fought for except the one thing they had actually demanded: independence. Antonio Maceo refused to sign. In a meeting with Spanish officers, he issued what became known as the Protesta Baragua, declaring that he would not accept peace without freedom. He eventually went into exile rather than accept Spanish terms, but his protest meant something. The war had ended without resolving the essential question. Cuba was still a colony. The fire had been banked, not extinguished. And a young student in Madrid, barely a teenager when the 10 Years' War began, was already forming the convictions that would one day reignite it. The ink on the Pact of Zañón was barely dry before the shooting started again. Just 18 months after the 10 Years' War ended, a fresh uprising erupted in eastern Cuba. Historians would call it the Guerra Chiquita, the Little War, and it lasted from 1879 to 1880. Led by veterans who shared Antonio Maceo's contempt for the Zañón Compromise, it burned briefly and collapsed quickly. Spain had rearmed. The rebel networks were fractured. The western provinces, home to Cuba's wealthiest plantations, again refused to join. By the summer of 1880, the Little War was over, its leaders dead or exiled, its promise extinguished almost before it could be spoken aloud. But something had shifted in the years that followed quietly and irrevocably. In 1880, Spain established the Patronado system, a transitional arrangement that kept formerly enslaved people bound to their former masters as unpaid apprentices. It was abolition in name only, a legal fiction designed to protect the interests of the planter class while satisfying reformers in Madrid. And yet, the pressure continued to mount. International opinion, the economic logic of free labor, and the organized resistance of Afro-Cubans themselves all pushed against the system's foundations. In 1886, the Patronado was abolished entirely. Slavery in Cuba was finished. The end of slavery did not bring equality. Former enslaved people entered a society that offered them freedom without land, rights without opportunity, and liberty without protection from the economic forces that would keep them impoverished for generations. The plantation economy simply reorganized itself around wage labor that often paid subsistence wages at best. And that plantation economy was rapidly changing hands. Through the 1880s and into the 1890s, American capital poured into Cuban sugar at an accelerating rate. Investors from the United States bought up estates devastated by the 10 Years' War at bargain prices, built modern centrales, the enormous industrial sugar mills that consolidated production from dozens of smaller farms, and began to treat Cuba less as a Spanish colony and more as an informal economic dependency of their own. By the early 1890s, the United States was purchasing more than 80% of Cuba's sugar exports. Spain ruled the island. America was quietly buying it. Spain, for its part, continued to break its promises. The political reforms pledged at Zañón never materialized in any meaningful form. Cuban representatives in the Spanish parliament held seats but wielded no real power. High tariffs on trade protected Spanish merchants while strangling Cuban economic development. The island was still governed for Spain's benefit, not Cuba's. For a generation raised in the aftermath of one failed war, watching their economy colonized by a new power while the old one refused to loosen its grip, patience was running out. The young student who had watched the 10 Years' War from exile was no longer a student. José Marti was becoming something far more dangerous to Spanish rule. He had watched Cuba burn from a distance for most of his adult life. Arrested at 16 for sedition, sentenced to hard labor in a limestone quarry, then exiled to Spain, then to Mexico, Venezuela, and finally New York, José Marti had spent decades learning what it meant to love a country he could not live in. By the time he settled in Manhattan in 1880, he was 32 years old, penniless, and absolutely certain of what he had to do. New York gave him a platform. He wrote constantly, brilliantly, producing journalism and poetry that circulated across Latin America and the Cuban exile communities of Tampa and Key West. His prose was luminous, his arguments precise, his moral vision expansive. He wrote about horses and lilies and the dignity of ordinary people. He also wrote about empire. What separated Marti from the revolutionary leaders who came before him was not simply his eloquence. It was his insistence that the Cuba worth fighting for had to be something entirely new. Not merely independent from Spain, but genuinely free in ways that Cuban society had never managed to be. He rejected the racial hierarchies that had poisoned the island's politics for centuries. He wrote that there was no such thing as race, only humanity, and that any Cuban revolution that preserved the privileges of the white Creole elite would be no revolution at all. For a society built on centuries of slavery, these were radical words. He was equally clear about the danger approaching from the north. American capital was already reshaping Cuba's economy, as the previous decades had made brutally plain. Marti warned anyone who would listen that trading Spanish colonialism for American neocolonialism was no victory. His famous final letter, written hours before his death, described the monster of American expansionism and his determination to stand against it. He understood something that many of his contemporaries did not want to acknowledge. The struggle for Cuban independence would have to be waged on two fronts. On April 10, 1892, in Tampa, Marti founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party. Unlike the fragmented exile networks that had failed previous uprisings, this organization was disciplined, structured, and deliberately inclusive. It drew tobacco workers, Afro-Cuban veterans, intellectuals, and farmers into a single political body united around a common program. Marti traveled ceaselessly, raising money in cigar factories where workers donated a portion of their weekly wages to the cause. He worked to bring the two great military commanders of the previous generation, Antonio Maceo and Máximo Gómez, back into the fold. By late 1894, the preparations were nearly complete. The plan called for coordinated uprisings across the island, timed to prevent Spain from concentrating its forces. Weapons were purchased, ships were loaded, networks inside Cuba were activated. Then, disaster struck. In January 1895, American authorities seized 3 ships carrying arms in Florida, acting on Spanish intelligence. The operation was exposed. Marti made a decision that surprised even his closest allies. Rather than waiting to rebuild, he ordered the uprising to proceed immediately. On February 24, 1895, Cubans rose across the island. The date would be remembered forever as the beginning of the War of Independence. Marti himself landed on Cuban soil in early April, wading ashore at night near the eastern coast. For a man who had spent his life writing about Cuba, simply standing on the island was a form of completion. He was given a military commission, though experienced commanders worried about sending a poet into battle. Their fears were realized within weeks. On May 19, 1895, at a skirmish near the Contramestre River called the Battle of Dos Rios, Marti rode forward on a white horse into Spanish rifle fire. He was struck and killed almost instantly. He was 42 years old. The military campaign he had launched would continue without him, grinding toward a conclusion he would never see. But something more lasting than victory had been secured. Cuba now had a martyr, an apostle, a dream given a human face. The independence movement would survive defeats, foreign interventions, and decades of compromise. Through all of it, Marti's words would remain, waiting to be claimed by whoever needed them next. The dream survived the dreamer. With Marti dead in the grass at Dos Rios, command passed to the two men who had shaped Cuban guerrilla warfare for a generation. Máximo Gómez, the Dominican-born strategist, and Antonio Maceo, the Afro-Cuban general whose physical courage had become legendary, now carried the revolution forward on entirely military terms. What followed was one of the most audacious campaigns in Caribbean history. In late 1895, Maceo launched a westward invasion across the entire length of Cuba, from the eastern mountains all the way to Pinar del Rio province at the island's far tip. His column covered nearly 1,000 miles of hostile territory in roughly 3 months, fighting dozens of engagements, evading Spanish encirclements, and demonstrating to the world that Cuban forces could operate wherever they chose. Spain had believed the rebellion would remain confined to the poorer eastern provinces. Maceo proved them catastrophically wrong. Spain's response revealed both its desperation and its brutality. General Valeriano Weyler arrived in Havana in early 1896 carrying orders to end the war by any means necessary. His solution was the Reconcentración policy, a strategy that forced hundreds of thousands of rural Cubans into fortified camps near Spanish-held towns, stripping the guerrillas of their civilian support base by destroying the civilian population itself. The camps were death traps. Food was inadequate, sanitation non-existent, disease rampant. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 400,000 Cubans died as a result of Reconcentración. American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, published the atrocity stories with enormous enthusiasm. The word Butcher Whaler appeared in headlines across the United States. Then, in December 1896, the revolution suffered a wound from which its spirit never fully recovered. Antonio Maceo, ambushed near Havana during a scouting mission, was killed by Spanish fire. He was 51 years old. The man who had survived more than 25 recorded wounds across 2 wars of independence died in the kind of small, sudden skirmish that history rarely remembers. Cuba remembered it. By early 1898, Spain was exhausted and the Cuban forces were grinding toward a victory that was, if slow, becoming increasingly inevitable. Then came the explosion that changed everything. On the night of February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor, blew up. 266 American sailors died. The cause was never definitively established. Modern investigations have suggested an accidental internal explosion. It did not matter. American newspapers had already decided. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became a national rallying cry within days. What followed stripped away any remaining pretense that American concern for Cuba was humanitarian. Congress declared war on Spain in April. American forces landed in Cuba that summer. The charge up San Juan Hill in July became the defining image of the conflict, Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders ascending into legend. It was a genuinely decisive battle. But the Cuban fighters who had been bleeding and dying for 3 years, who had brought Spain to this breaking point, were largely excluded from the final campaign and entirely excluded from the surrender ceremony in Santiago on July 17, 1898. Cuba had not won its independence. It had been liberated by a power whose intentions Marti had foreseen with terrible clarity. Spain signed away its empire in December at the Treaty of Paris. Cuban representatives were not invited. The island that had fought for 30 years across 2 wars now found itself in the hands of a new patron, one with a different flag but familiar ambitions. What that occupation would mean for Cuban sovereignty was a question that would define the next half-century. The American military occupied Cuba for nearly 4 years after the Spanish surrender. General Leonard Wood administered the island with the efficiency of a colonial governor, building roads, reorganizing courts, and overseeing a genuine public health campaign that dramatically reduced yellow fever in Havana. The Americans were not entirely without accomplishment. But administration is not sovereignty, and Cubans understood the difference. The critical question was, what would come next? As Cuba moved toward drafting its own constitution in 1901, the United States Congress provided a clear answer. Senator Orville Platt of Connecticut attached a rider to an Army appropriations bill that would define Cuban sovereignty for the next 3 decades. The Platt Amendment, as it became known, required Cuba to embed its provisions directly into the Cuban Constitution as a condition of American military withdrawal. The provisions were extraordinary. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it judged Cuban independence or domestic order to be threatened. Cuba was prohibited from entering into any foreign treaty that might compromise its independence or accumulate public debt beyond certain limits. And the island was required to sell or lease lands to the United States for coaling and naval stations. Cuban delegates debated the amendment with anguish. Several refused to accept it entirely. But the choice was stark and deliberate. Accept the amendment or the occupation continued indefinitely. By a vote of 16 to 11, the Cuban Constitutional Convention incorporated the Platt Amendment into its founding document. Cuba was born as a republic with a leash already around its neck. That leash had a physical anchor. In 1903, Cuba signed a perpetual lease granting the United States control of a naval station at Guantanamo Bay on the island's southeastern coast. The base would become one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere, and more than a century later, it remains in American hands, a geographic reminder of the terms under which Cuban independence began. Tomás Estrada Palma became Cuba's first president when formal independence was declared on May 20, 1902. He was a respectable choice, a veteran of the independence movement who had lived in exile in New York for many years and held American citizenship before his election. His very biography spoke to the complicated nature of Cuban sovereignty. He governed competently at first, but his second term became a disaster of electoral fraud and political violence. In 1906, facing an armed rebellion by opposition Liberal Party forces, Estrada Palma made a fateful request. He asked Washington to intervene. The United States obliged immediately, sending troops back to the island under the authority the Platt Amendment had so conveniently provided. American Administrator Charles Magoon governed Cuba from 1906 to 1909, a second occupation that confirmed what many Cubans had feared since 1901. The resentment this generated was deep and lasting. Cuban nationalists had fought 30 years for independence, had watched their greatest leaders die, had endured reconciliation and war and occupation, only to find that their republic could be suspended at Washington's discretion. The Platt Amendment became a symbol not of American generosity, but of imperial condescension, a document that treated Cuban self-governance as a privilege to be revoked rather than a right to be honored. That resentment did not evaporate when American troops departed again in 1909. It settled into the foundation of Cuban political life, where it would ferment through decades of corrupt governments, American-backed strongmen, and widening inequality. The Republic had been born. But the questions surrounding its birth, who truly controlled Cuba and for whose benefit, would echo forward with growing force through the 20th century. The Americans had left their soldiers behind, but they had not left Cuba behind. What followed the second occupation was not independence so much as a different kind of dependency, one measured not in troops but in dollars. By the 1910s, American capital was flooding into Cuba at a pace that reshaped the physical landscape of the island. United Fruit Company, the Cuban-American Sugar Company, and dozens of smaller enterprises bought up vast tracts of land across Oriente and Camagüey provinces, converting them into industrial sugar operations of breathtaking scale. Mills called centrales rose from the countryside like small cities, each one consuming thousands of acres of cane and the labor of thousands of workers. By 1920, American businesses controlled roughly 80% of Cuba's sugar production. The island had not been colonized again in name, but the economics told a different story. Sugar had always mattered in Cuba. Now it was everything. And for a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed like everything was enough. The First World War had devastated European beet sugar production, and Cuban cane rushed to fill the void. Prices climbed steadily, then dramatically. In 1920, the price of sugar reached nearly 23 cents per pound, an almost incomprehensible figure compared to pre-war norms. Cubans called it the dance of the millions, and for good reason. Fortunes were made in weeks. Havana's wealthy elite built mansions along the Malecon and in the leafy suburb of Miramar. Banks extended credit recklessly. Speculators borrowed against future harvests that hadn't yet been planted. Then, in the autumn of 1920, the music stopped. Global sugar prices collapsed with terrifying speed, falling to less than 4 cents per pound within months. Cuban banks failed. The government teetered on insolvency. Landowners who had borrowed heavily lost everything. The crash revealed what the boom had disguised. Cuba had bet its entire economy on a single commodity, and the house had won. The rural poor had never truly participated in the dance of the millions to begin with. Afro-Cuban workers who had fought and died in the wars of independence found themselves systematically excluded from the prosperity that followed. Despite the multiracial solidarity of the independence movement, Cuban society had hardened into sharp racial hierarchies. Government employment, professional advancement, and social prestige remained largely the preserve of white Cubans. In 1912, a desperate uprising by the Partido Independiente de Color was crushed by government forces with appalling brutality, leaving thousands dead. The republic that José Marti had envisioned as a nation without racial distinction was becoming something far narrower. While the countryside suffered, Havana glittered for a different clientele. Prohibition in the United States sent a river of American tourists southward in search of legal rum and easy pleasures. Hotels, casinos, and nightclubs multiplied. The city acquired a reputation as a place where American rules did not apply, a pressure valve for a nation that had outlawed its own appetites. The tourist economy brought money, but it also brought a particular kind of contempt. The sense that Cuba existed primarily for the enjoyment of its northern neighbor. Into this volatile mixture stepped Gerardo Machado, elected president in 1924 on promises of national development and honest government. He built roads and a grand capitol building, but his ambitions outgrew his mandate. Machado extended his own presidency illegally, crushed opposition newspapers, and turned the rural police into instruments of political terror. Dissidents disappeared. Student protesters were beaten and killed in Havana's streets. The republic that had always been imperfect was curdling into something genuinely menacing. By the early 1930s, Cuba was a nation primed for explosion. The explosion came in the summer of 1933. Strikes paralyzed Havana. Students fought soldiers in the streets. Even members of Machado's own political coalition abandoned him. When the United States, newly represented by Ambassador Sumner Welles, made clear that Washington would no longer prop up the regime, the last supports gave way. On August 12th, Gerardo Machado boarded a plane for Nassau with a reported collection of gold coins and pet dogs, fleeing a country that had turned entirely against him. But revolutions are easier to start than to steer. The provisional government that followed Machado was swept aside within weeks by a force that nobody in the traditional political class had anticipated. On September 4th, 1933, a group of discontented army sergeants and enlisted men seized control of military installations across the island. Their leader was a stenographer-turned-soldier named Fulgencio Batista, 32 years old, mixed race, born in poverty in Oriente Province. In a single night, he and his fellow sergeants abolished the existing officer corps, promoted themselves, and seized control of the Cuban military. The sergeants' revolt, as history would remember it, was one of the most audacious institutional coups of the 20th century. The sergeants threw their support behind a reform-minded civilian government led by Dr. Ramon Grau San Martin, a university professor who represented exactly the kind of change that Cuba's students and workers had been demanding. In his 100 days in office, Grau moved with remarkable speed. His government granted women the right to vote, established an 8-hour workday, and canceled the despised Platt Amendment that had allowed American military intervention. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed as though genuine revolution might finally arrive. Washington was not pleased. The Roosevelt administration, deeply suspicious of Grau's nationalism and unwilling to recognize his government, worked quietly to undermine him. Batista, who had become Army Chief of Staff and the real power behind the civilian facade, proved a willing partner. In January of 1934, Batista withdrew military support from Grau, and the progressive experiment collapsed after just 100 days in power. What followed was a decade of shadow rule. Cuba cycled through a series of presidents, some brutal, some merely pliable, but all of them ultimately answerable to the man with the guns. Batista did not sit in the presidential palace himself. He did not need to. He controlled promotions, budgets, and force. Political opponents were jailed or killed. Labor organizers were watched carefully. Yet Batista was not simply a conventional strongman. He cultivated genuine support among Afro-Cuban communities, poor workers, and rural populations who recognized in him someone who had come from their world. By the late 1930s, Cuba's political climate was shifting again. A constituent assembly produced the Constitution of 1940, a remarkably progressive document guaranteeing labor rights, social welfare protections, and civil liberties that placed it among the most advanced constitutions in the hemisphere. It was a moment of genuine democratic aspiration, however fragile. And then Fulgencio Batista did something unexpected. He ran for president openly, won a legitimate election, and served a constitutional term until 1944, when he peacefully transferred power to his elected successor. For one brief chapter, the strong man had become something approaching a democrat. It would not last. The story of Batista and Cuba was far from finished, and the peaceful transfer of power in 1944 would look, in retrospect, like the calm at the center of a gathering storm. The next decade would bring corruption, disillusionment, and a young generation burning with revolutionary ideas. The peaceful transfer of power in 1944 brought Ramon Grau San Martin back to the presidency, the same reformer Batista had toppled a decade earlier. Cubans celebrated. Democracy, it seemed, had finally taken root. What followed instead was a masterclass in disappointment. Grau's Auténtico party had promised honest government and genuine reform. What it delivered was corruption on a breathtaking scale. Ministers enriched themselves openly. Government funds vanished into private accounts. When Carlos Prios Socarrás succeeded Grau in 1948, the pattern only deepened. The Progressive Constitution of 1940 gathered dust while the men elected to honor it treated the treasury as a personal inheritance. A generation of idealistic Cubans watched their democratic hopes curdle into something bitter and unrecognizable. Meanwhile, somebody else had noticed Cuba's possibilities entirely. His name was Meyer Lansky, a slight, soft-spoken man from the streets of Manhattan who had built one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history. Lansky understood numbers the way musicians understand rhythm, intuitively, completely. And the numbers in Cuba were extraordinary. Lansky had first visited Havana in the 1930s, cementing relationships with Batista himself. Now, with the Auténticos in power and their hands perpetually extended, the arrangement expanded dramatically. American mobsters poured money into Havana's hotels and casinos. The Nacional, the San Sushi, the Montmartre, these were not merely gambling dens, but palaces of orchestrated pleasure, where the roulette wheels spun beneath crystal chandeliers and the drinks arrived before you thought to order them. For American tourists, Havana offered everything that post-war propriety denied them at home. The city was only 90 miles from Florida, reachable by ferry or a short flight, yet it existed in an entirely different moral atmosphere. The casinos ran all night. The cabarets featured performers of a caliber that rivaled anything in New York or Paris. And threading through all of it was music, urgent and irresistible. The late 1940s belonged to the Mambo. Perez Prado, the self-proclaimed Mambo King, was electrifying Havana audiences with a sound that seemed to compress the entire nervous system into a single rhythm. Tourists stumbled home at dawn with ringing ears and empty wallets, which was precisely the point. But step 40 minutes outside Havana, and the neon fantasy evaporated completely. In the provinces of Oriente and Camagüey, Guajiro families worked sugar harvests for wages that could not sustain a dog. Rural clinics were ghost buildings. Schools sat empty for lack of teachers. The Constitution guaranteed rights that existed nowhere in the countryside. Two Cubas had always existed. Now the distance between them was a chasm, and on one side the mob counted money while on the other side, a generation with nothing to lose was beginning to ask harder questions. One of them was a young law student in Havana, restless and ferociously ambitious, who had read the Constitution carefully and was furious that nobody was honoring it. On the 10th of March 1952, Fulgencio Batista climbed into a car before sunrise and drove to Camp Columbia, the main military garrison outside Havana. Within hours, without a single shot fired, he had seized control of the Cuban armed forces. President Prio Socarrás fled to the Mexican embassy in his pajamas. Elections scheduled for June were canceled. The Constitution of 1940, already dishonored, was now simply abolished. It had taken Batista roughly 77 minutes to end Cuban democracy. Washington recognized the new government within 17 days. The logic was coldly practical. The Korean War was grinding on, the Cold War was deepening, and Batista was reliably anti-communist. American investment in Cuba, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, would be protected. The moral cost of endorsing a military coup barely registered in the calculations. For ordinary Cubans watching American naval vessels anchor in Havana Harbor, the message was unmistakable. Their aspirations were, at most, a secondary concern. For the young lawyer watching all of this, it was the final instruction he needed. Fidel Castro was 25 years old in 1952, trained at the University of Havana, constitutionally minded and burning with an ambition that could not find a legal outlet. He had planned to run for Congress. The coup had erased that path entirely. He petitioned the courts to declare Batista's government unconstitutional. The courts declined. If the law would not remedy the situation, then something else would have to. What followed was more audacious than it was sensible. Before dawn on the 26th of July, 1953, a convoy of cars carrying 160 young rebels approached the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest military installation on the island. The plan was to seize the arsenal, distribute weapons, and spark a popular uprising. The plan collapsed almost immediately. A routine army patrol spotted the convoy. The element of surprise evaporated. In the firefight and its aftermath, more than 60 rebels were captured and executed, most of them tortured first. Fidel and his brother Raul were captured separately, days later in the mountains. The attack was a military disaster. What happened next transformed it into something else entirely. At his trial in September, Castro was permitted to speak. He spoke for hours. He indicted not himself but the Batista regime, the poverty, the corruption, the betrayal of Cuban ideals stretching back to José Marti. He concluded with words that would echo for generations. History, he told the court, would absolve him. The court sentenced him to 15 years on the Isle of Pines. He served less than 2. Public pressure and a general amnesty secured his release in May of 1955. Batista, perhaps believing that imprisonment had broken Castro's nerve, let him go. It had not. Within weeks, Castro understood that remaining in Cuba meant rearrest or worse. He left for Mexico City, where he assembled a small, disciplined group of exiles, trained them in guerrilla tactics with a former soldier named Ernesto Guevara, an Argentine doctor whose diagnosis of Latin American misery mirrored his own, and formalized the movement under the name he had chosen to honor the fallen date of the Moncada attack. The 26th of July movement was now a formal organization with a plan, a symbol, and a destination. That destination was Cuba, and the vessel that would carry them there was already being purchased, a leaking, overcrowded yacht named the Granma, waiting in a Mexican harbor for the moment to sail. The Granma reached Cuban waters on the 2nd of December, 1956. It was 2 days late, overcrowded with 82 men instead of the planned 50, and the landing site was a mangrove swamp on the southwestern coast rather than the beach where allies had been waiting. The men waded ashore in chest-deep water, losing weapons and supplies to the mud. It was, by any military standard, a shambles. 3 days later, it became a catastrophe. At a sugarcane field called Alegria de Pio, Batista's forces caught the exhausted rebels in the open. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Men scattered into the cane fields, into the hills, into the confusion of gunfire and shouting. When it was over, the 26th of July movement had been reduced to perhaps 20 survivors, scattered across unfamiliar terrain, hunted, and nearly broken. Fidel Castro regrouped with his brother Raúl and a handful of others. Among them was the Argentine doctor Ernesto Guevara, who had taken a wound to the neck and carried a box of ammunition he would not abandon even as he ran. That decision to survive, to keep moving, would reshape an entire hemisphere. The survivors climbed into the Sierra Maestra, the long, rugged mountain spine that runs along Cuba's southeastern coast, rising to peaks that touch nearly 6,000 feet. It was remote, poor, and largely forgotten by Havana. And it was exactly the right place to begin again. The peasants of the Sierra Maestra had their own long grievances. They farmed land they did not own, paid rents to distant landlords, and received almost nothing from a government that viewed them as invisible. Castro's movement offered something different: land, dignity, and the suggestion that the poor might matter. Slowly, cautiously, the mountain communities began to provide food, shelter, intelligence, and eventually recruits. A guerrilla army does not begin with weapons. It begins with trust, and the Sierra Maestra offered that. Guevara emerged in these months as something more than a soldier. He organized field clinics, ran literacy sessions, and enforced a strict code of conduct toward civilians that separated the rebels from the soldiers they were fighting. He also proved a ruthless and effective military commander. By 1957, he was leading his own column. His thinking about guerrilla warfare was sharpening into a theory that would later travel far beyond Cuba's mountains. The revolution was never only in the mountains. In the cities, a parallel network called the Llano, the lowland opposition, organized strikes, sabotage, and weapons smuggling. Students, workers, and urban professionals risked their lives in ways that rarely made the news but kept constant pressure on Batista's government. The relationship between the mountain fighters and the urban networks was sometimes cooperative and sometimes tense, marked by disagreements over strategy and authority. But together they constituted a movement that could not be simply decapitated. Batista's military, despite its superior numbers and American-supplied equipment, could not dislodge the rebels. Corruption had hollowed out officer ranks. Soldiers had little appetite for climbing mountains to fight men who moved like smoke. A massive offensive in the summer of 1958, sending thousands of troops into the Sierra Maestra, collapsed in disarray. The army that was supposed to end the rebellion came back diminished, demoralized, and in some cases defecting. In Washington, the calculations were shifting. A regime that could not defeat fewer than 1,000 guerrillas was a liability. Arms shipments slowed. Quiet signals were sent suggesting that perhaps Batista's time had passed. The mountains were holding. The cities were restless. And the road down from the Sierra Maestra was beginning to open. The last days of December 1958 had the quality of a dream dissolving in real time. Che Guevara arrived at Santa Clara, Cuba's fourth largest city and a critical rail junction in the heart of the island, with a column of rebels that should have had no business taking on a fortified garrison of thousands. Yet something had broken inside Batista's military. When Guevara's fighters derailed an armored train carrying weapons and reinforcements, government soldiers surrendered by the hundreds. They simply stopped fighting. Santa Clara fell on the 29th of December. The spine of the island was cut. At his palace in Havana, Batista understood what the map was telling him. Shortly after midnight on the 1st of January 1959, Fulgencio Batista gathered a small circle of loyalists, loaded what he could carry, and boarded a plane for the Dominican Republic. He told almost no one. Generals who had commanded his armies woke that morning to find their president had vanished. Soldiers abandoned checkpoints. Police stripped off their uniforms in the streets. A regime that had held power through torture, assassination, and American patronage evaporated before dawn like smoke over the Malecon. Havana erupted. Crowds poured into the streets, their voices rising into something that was equal parts joy, disbelief, and rage. Parking meters, long despised as symbols of corrupt city contracts, were torn from sidewalks. The Havana casinos that had made fortunes for American organized crime syndicates were stormed. Photographs of Batista were pulled from walls. The city did not sleep that night, nor the night after. The sound of celebration and the occasional crack of settling scores echoed through streets hung with the blue and red of the 26th of July movement. Fidel Castro was still in Santiago, 600 miles to the east, when he heard the news. He did not rush. Instead, he organized what would become one of the most deliberate and theatrically masterful political processions in modern Latin American history. For 6 days, Castro's column moved slowly westward along the length of Cuba, stopping in town after town, drawing crowds that grew larger with each passing mile. This was not simply a military march. It was a coronation conducted in plain sight, an extended argument that the revolution belonged to the people who lined those dusty roads, weeping and pressing forward to touch the trucks carrying bearded young men in olive fatigues. Castro understood instinctively what cameras were already beginning to transmit to a watching world. Cuba was not just changing governments. Cuba was being reborn. He arrived in Havana on the 8th of January. The crowds were incomprehensible in their size and noise. Hundreds of thousands pressed along the avenues, climbing lampposts, leaning from windows. When Castro spoke that night, 2 white doves were released and one landed on his shoulder, a moment the crowd received as something close to prophecy. The world was indeed watching. American newspapers ran front-page photographs. Television networks scrambled correspondence. Here was a story with every element the moment required: a young, bearded romantic who had defeated a dictator from the mountains, who quoted Jose Marti and spoke in complete sentences and seemed, at that electric instant, to represent something genuinely new. Yet, even in the first weeks, other notes were audible beneath the celebration. Revolutionary tribunals convened across the island, trying Batista's secret policemen and military officers for crimes that were real and documented and numerous. Hundreds were convicted. Dozens were executed by firing squad. The proceedings disturbed some observers abroad, though within Cuba, where the memory of Batista's torture chambers was fresh and visceral, reaction was more complicated. The revolution had triumphed. What it would become was still unwritten, its direction contested even among those who had made it possible. What was already clear to Havana and to Washington and to Moscow and to every revolutionary movement watching from the mountains and barrios of Latin America was that something irreversible had occurred 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The question now was whose revolution this truly was, and the answer to that question would define the decades ahead. The honeymoon, if it could be called that, lasted barely a season. By the spring of 1959, Fidel Castro's government was moving with a speed that unsettled even some who had celebrated his arrival. In May, the agrarian reform law reshaped the island's economy overnight. Holdings larger than 1,000 acres were seized by the state. Sugar plantations, cattle ranches, and vast tracts of farmland that had been in American corporate hands for decades were absorbed without anything approaching fair compensation. United Fruit, the Cuban-American Sugar Company, and dozens of other enterprises watched their properties vanish behind a signature. Washington's reaction was cold and swift. American officials who had initially extended cautious goodwill toward the new government now began reaching different conclusions. Here was not a reformer trimming around the edges. Here was something else entirely. The executions, meanwhile, continued. At La Cabaña fortress on the edge of Havana Harbor, Che Guevara presided as military commander over revolutionary tribunals that worked through the nights. Former Batista officers, police torturers, and informers faced firing squads in numbers that climbed past 500 in the first year alone. Some of the condemned were genuinely guilty of documented atrocities. Others had thinner cases against them. Appeals were rare, pardons rarer still. Journalists who pressed for moderation were told the Cuban people demanded justice, and that revolution was not a dinner party. Those who could read the direction of things began to leave. The first wave of departure came from Cuba's upper and professional classes, the very people whose comfort and education had seemed to promise a stable future. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, business owners, and landowners packed what they could carry and flew to Miami. By 1960, Miami's Cuban exile community numbered in the tens of thousands and was growing by the week. Entire neighborhoods took on the character of a displaced Havana, complete with Cuban restaurants, Spanish-language newspapers, and an overwhelming shared conviction that the revolution would collapse and they would return within months. Most waited decades. Many never went back. By 1960, Castro's government was nationalizing American properties at a pace that left no room for diplomatic fiction. Telephone companies, oil refineries, banks, and eventually the sugar mills themselves passed into state hands. Washington responded with economic pressure, slashing the American quota for Cuban sugar and tightening trade restrictions. Cuba turned where it could toward the Soviet Union, which offered to purchase the sugar America refused and to supply the oil refineries were now demanding. The spiral accelerated. In January of 1961, the United States severed diplomatic relations with Cuba entirely, closing its embassy in Havana and ordering Cuban diplomats out of Washington. Two countries that had been bound together economically and politically for 60 years now stared at each other across a gap that was growing wider by the hour. And then Castro told his people what it had all been moving toward. In April of 1961, on the eve of events that would bring the two nations to open confrontation, Castro declared publicly what many had suspected and some had feared. The Cuban Revolution was socialist. The island would not be following the American model or any other. Cuba had chosen its path. It was a declaration that closed certain doors permanently and opened others into a 40-year Cold War confrontation that would bring the world to the edge of nuclear war. transform Cuban society from the ground up, and make this small island one of the most consequential pieces of geography in the 20th century. The missiles, the exiles, and the Bay of Pigs were already waiting just over the horizon. The plan had been taking shape since the final months of the Eisenhower administration. The Central Intelligence Agency, working through its director Alan Dully, had begun training a force of Cuban exiles in Guatemala in 1960, with one objective in clear view: put armed men on Cuban soil, spark a popular uprising, and end Castro's government before it could consolidate itself permanently. When John F. Kennedy inherited the presidency in January of 1961, he inherited the plan along with it. His advisors assured him it was sound. The exiles were motivated, they said. The Cuban people were restless. Airstrikes would neutralize Castro's small air force. The landing would trigger the internal revolt that would finish the job. Kennedy, only weeks into office, approved it with modifications that would prove fatal. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exile fighters, organized under the CIA's Brigade 2506, came ashore on the southern coast of Cuba at a place called Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. Almost nothing went as planned. The preliminary airstrikes had been scaled back at Kennedy's insistence, leaving Castro's aircraft intact. Those surviving planes found the exile brigade supply ships on the water and sank them, cutting the invasion force off from its ammunition, communications equipment, and reserves. The coral reefs along the bay, inadequately scouted, shredded landing craft before they reached the beach. And the popular uprising never materialized. What materialized instead was Fidel Castro. He mobilized within hours, personally taking command of the counterattack with an energy that galvanized his forces. Eyewitness accounts place him at the front, directing artillery, moving between positions, refusing sleep. Within 72 hours, the invasion was broken. The exile fighters, stranded without resupply and overwhelmed by a Cuban military that outnumbered them decisively, surrendered on April 19th. 1,189 men were taken prisoner. Kennedy went before the American public and accepted full responsibility, a gesture of political grace that did little to soften the strategic humiliation. The United States had organized, funded, and directed an illegal military operation against a neighboring country, and it had failed completely in full view of the world. For Castro, the victory was transformational. He had faced the Americans directly and prevailed. His revolutionary government, which critics had called fragile, now stood on firmer ground than ever. Internally, the invasion became the event that justified everything: the surveillance, the restrictions, the alignment with Moscow. That alignment deepened immediately. The captured exile fighters sat in Cuban prisons for 20 months before being ransomed, finally, in December of 1962, in exchange for $53 million in food and medicine. But before that ransom was paid, the world would pass through a far more dangerous crisis, one rooted in the same poisoned soil the Bay of Pigs had prepared. Cuba and the Soviet Union were now bound together in ways that would bring nuclear weapons to the edge of the Caribbean. The man in the Kremlin had a problem. Nikita Khrushchev, watching American power encircle the Soviet Union with missile bases from Britain to Turkey, decided in the spring of 1962 that the imbalance needed correcting. Cuba offered a solution: place Soviet nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida, and suddenly the Americans would understand what it felt like to live under the shadow of someone else's warheads. The operation was codenamed Anadir. Through the summer months, Soviet ships carried soldiers, equipment, and medium-range ballistic missiles across the Atlantic, disguised beneath ordinary cargo. Then came October 14th. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft made a routine pass over western Cuba, and its cameras captured something that was anything but routine. The photographs, analyzed overnight at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, showed unmistakable evidence of Soviet missile installations under construction. 16 days before a congressional election, President Kennedy was shown the images on the morning of October 16th. He gathered a secret advisory group, later known as XCOM, and began 13 days of deliberation that would determine whether civilization survived the decade. The options on the table ranged from doing nothing to launching immediate airstrikes. The military pushed hard for bombing. Kennedy resisted. On October 22nd, he went on national television and told the American people what was 90 miles off their southern coast. The world held its breath. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine, a careful word chosen deliberately over blockade, which carried legal implications of war. American warships formed a line across the Atlantic approaches to Cuba. Soviet cargo vessels loaded with additional military equipment were already en route. What would happen when they reached that line? The answer came on October 24th. Soviet ships approached, slowed, and stopped. They turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk reportedly whispered that the two sides had been eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow had just blinked. But the crisis was far from over. The missiles already on Cuban soil were being assembled with increasing speed. Beneath the public confrontation, frantic back-channel communications were underway. The Soviet ambassador met quietly with Kennedy's representatives. A deal took shape in the shadows. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would pledge never to invade the island. And in a secret agreement kept from the public for decades, Kennedy would quietly remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within several months. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the missiles would be withdrawn. The crisis was over. But in Havana, Fidel Castro was furious. He had not been consulted. The fate of his country and the terms under which nuclear weapons pointed at the United States from his soil would be removed had been decided entirely between Washington and Moscow. Castro reportedly put his fist through a wall when he heard the news. He had pushed Khrushchev to consider a first strike rather than capitulate. The Soviets had ignored him completely. The betrayal cut deep and permanently complicated the relationship between Cuba and its most powerful patron. Cuba had served as the stage for a superpower drama, and when the curtain fell, the Cubans had no speaking part in the ending. For the world, the crisis left a legacy measured in relief and reform. A direct telephone hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow to prevent future miscommunications from becoming catastrophes. Nuclear test ban treaties followed. Humanity had peered into the abyss and stepped back, shaken. For Cuba, the legacy was different. The island remained revolutionary, remained defiant, remained under the shadow of American hostility. Castro would channel that defiance outward into a foreign policy that would carry Cuban soldiers to the far corners of the world. Fury, it turned out, could be remarkably productive. Shut out of the superpower negotiations that determined his country's fate, Fidel Castro channeled his defiance into something audacious. Cuba would not merely survive as a socialist state, it would spread revolution across the developing world. No one embodied that mission more completely than Ernesto Che Guevara. The Argentine physician turned guerrilla commander believed Cuba's victory could be replicated anywhere that poverty and colonial exploitation had left populations desperate for change. In 1965, he disappeared from Havana and resurfaced in the Congo, hoping to ignite revolution in Central Africa. The campaign collapsed within months. Local fighters were disorganized, the conditions nothing like Cuba's mountains, and Guevara retreated in defeat. Bolivia would prove far worse. In 1967, Guevara led a small band of guerrillas into the Bolivian highlands, hoping peasants would rally to the cause. They did not. Isolated, betrayed, and hunted by Bolivian rangers trained by the CIA, Guevara was captured on October 8, 1967, and executed the following day. He was 39 years old. His death shocked the left around the world, but did not stop Havana. Cuba's most consequential military adventure came in Africa. When Angola descended into civil war after Portuguese colonial rule collapsed in 1975, Cuba dispatched tens of thousands of soldiers to support the socialist MPLA government against South African-backed forces. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale in 1987 and 88, where Cuban and Angolan forces repelled a South African offensive. Many historians consider it a turning point that accelerated South African withdrawal from Namibia and, ultimately, undermined the apartheid regime's confidence in its own military supremacy. Nelson Mandela would later call Cuba's role decisive. At home, the revolution built something genuinely remarkable. By the 1980s, Cuba had achieved near-universal literacy, down from estimated illiteracy rates above 30% before the revolution. The island trained doctors at a rate that allowed it to send medical brigades abroad while providing free health care to every Cuban citizen. Life expectancy climbed toward levels matching wealthy industrialized nations. But the socialist state had a darker architecture. Political dissent was not tolerated. Thousands of Cubans deemed enemies of the revolution were imprisoned. LGBTQ Cubans faced systematic persecution, forced into labor camps through much of the 1960s and 70s in campaigns of state-sanctioned cruelty. Artists, writers, and intellectuals who stepped outside ideological boundaries risked careers, freedom, and exile. Many chose exile. In April of 1980, when Castro briefly opened the port of Muriel, approximately 125,000 Cubans departed for Florida in a chaotic flotilla of small boats, driven by economic desperation and political exhaustion. Cuba had built a revolution and exported it across 2 continents. The question, as the 1980s drew toward their close, was whether the system could survive what was coming: the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of the subsidies that had kept the entire project afloat. The Soviet Union's collapse did not come as a single catastrophic blow. It arrived as a slow hemorrhage, and Cuba bled for years. When Moscow dissolved in December of 1991, the island lost roughly 85% of its foreign trade overnight. Soviet oil shipments vanished. Food imports collapsed. Cuba's GDP fell by approximately 35% between 1990 and 1993, a contraction rivaling the worst economic disasters of the 20th century. Castro gave the catastrophe an almost defiant name: the special period in time of peace. Cubans experienced it as something far less dignified. Blackouts lasted 16 hours a day. Caloric intake dropped so severely that a neurological epidemic swept the island, leaving thousands with vision and nerve damage caused by malnutrition. Oxen replaced tractors in fields that lacked fuel. Bicycles replaced buses on city streets. The revolution that had promised abundance now asked its citizens to simply endure. And yet the regime survived. How? Partly through brutal pragmatism. Castro legalized the American dollar in 1993, an ideological concession that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Tourism, once criticized as a corrupting capitalist enterprise, became the lifeline of the economy. Hotels rose along the coastline. European and Canadian visitors arrived by the hundreds of thousands, spending hard currency that flowed into state coffers while ordinary Cubans remained legally excluded from the same hotels and restaurants. A grotesque two-tier society emerged, dividing those with access to dollars from those without. Remittances from the Cuban diaspora, predominantly from Miami, added another stream of survival income, threading economic lifelines directly into Cuban households across the island. In the summer of 1994, desperation boiled over. In August, thousands of Cubans lashed together inner tubes, wooden planks, and whatever floated and pushed off into the Florida Straits. The Balsaro crisis, as it became known, sent at least 30,000 rafters into some of the most dangerous waters in the hemisphere. Hundreds drowned. The crisis forced a migration agreement with Washington, but it also exposed the depth of disillusionment that decades of revolutionary rhetoric had failed to erase. Then came Elian Gonzalez. In November of 1999, a 6-year-old boy was found floating off the Florida coast after his mother drowned attempting to reach the United States. The custody battle that followed consumed both nations. Castro transformed Elian's case into a nationalist crusade, staging mass demonstrations demanding the child's return. When federal agents seized the boy from his Miami relatives in April of 2000 and returned him to his Cuban father, Castro claimed a symbolic victory that briefly energized domestic support. The deeper rescue, however, came from Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, elected in 1998 on a platform of Bolivarian socialism, admired Castro deeply. Beginning in 2000, Venezuela supplied Cuba with roughly 100,000 barrels of oil daily at preferential rates, an arrangement that gradually replaced what Moscow had once provided. Cuba had survived the unthinkable. But survival and prosperity remained very different things, and an aging Fidel Castro was approaching the moment when even he could not hold the system together alone. In the summer of 2006, something unprecedented happened in revolutionary Cuba. Fidel Castro, the man who had survived a CIA-backed invasion, hundreds of assassination attempts, and the collapse of his Soviet patron, announced that he was sick. Intestinal surgery forced him to hand provisional power to his younger brother Raúl in July of that year. For the first time in nearly half a century, someone other than Fidel Castro governed the island. Cubans and the world waited to see if he would recover. He did not recover fully enough to return. In February of 2008, Raúl Castro became president officially, and an era quietly closed before Fidel had even died. Raúl was a different kind of leader. Blunter, less theatrical, more interested in institutional order than revolutionary romance. He understood that the Cuban economy was suffocating, and he moved with cautious, deliberate steps to loosen its constraints. Cubans were permitted to buy and sell property and cars for the first time in decades. Small private businesses, known as cuentapropistas, were allowed to operate legally. Farmers received more autonomy over their land. The changes were modest by any outside standard, but within Cuba's tightly controlled system, they represented genuine movement. None of it was enough to lift the economy into prosperity, but it signaled that the revolution's managers understood survival required adaptation. Then came the moment almost no one had predicted. On December 17, 2014, President Barack Obama and Raúl Castro announced simultaneously that the United States and Cuba would restore diplomatic relations after more than 50 years of hostility. Obama flew to Havana in March of 2016, the first sitting American president to visit in 88 years. For a brief and extraordinary period, it seemed the long estrangement might finally end. It did not last. Donald Trump's administration reversed course beginning in 2017, reimposing restrictions, tightening the embargo, and redesignating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. The diplomatic opening closed almost as quickly as it had appeared. November of 2016 brought the moment that many had assumed would reshape everything. Fidel Castro died on the 25th of that month at age 90. The streets of Miami erupted in celebration. In Havana, official mourning was observed. Yet Cuba did not transform overnight. The system Fidel had built proved more durable than the man himself. Raúl Castro formally stepped down as president in April of 2018, handing power to Miguel Díaz-Canel, the first Cuban leader born after the revolution. Raúl retained influence as head of the Communist Party until 2021, ensuring continuity even in transition. The crisis that followed, however, belonged entirely to the new generation to confront. On July 11, 2021, something extraordinary and deeply dangerous, from the government's perspective, erupted across the island. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets in spontaneous protests spanning dozens of cities, chanting for freedom and demanding change. Food shortages, medicine shortages, lengthy blackouts, and the crushing weight of pandemic isolation had pushed citizens past endurance. The government responded with arrests, internet shutdowns, and a crackdown that imprisoned hundreds. The protests of July 2021 represented the largest public demonstrations Cuba had seen since 1994, and they announced something the regime could not easily dismiss. The revolutionary generation was gone, and the Cubans who remained were running out of patience. Miguel Díaz-Canel and those around him now govern an island caught between an ideology hardened over 6 decades and a population increasingly connected to the outside world through smartphones and social media. The embargo tightens. The economy contracts. Emigration has surged to levels not seen since the Mariel boat lift. 500 years after Columbus first glimpsed this island's green shores, Cuba's story remains unfinished, its future unresolved, its people still searching for the freedom that has always seemed just out of reach. From the ashes of Taíno civilization to the smartphones of a new generation, Cuba has never stopped defying the expectations of empire. Subscribe for more histories of the islands, revolutions, and forgotten peoples who shaped our world.